The most striking thing for me is the depiction of Antarctica on old maps. After all, we only discovered it in 1820, and yet it could be found on maps that were produced in the 16th century and in an astonishing level of detail. The name of the man who was perplexed by these historical inconsistencies is Graham Hancock, but the bottom line is that the findings are even more profound. As the Antarctic maps are based on significantly older sources, they testify to the existence of a lost advanced civilization that paved the way for all subsequent civilizations. But how is that possible? How can such a highly developed people who traveled and mapped the entire world simply fall into oblivion? Well, it would probably take two things: a massive natural disaster that wiped out the people, and a modern research community that vehemently resists the historical truth. And according to Hancock, both are true. If you paid attention in history class, then you know that the Sumerians are considered the first people to have mastered the step to advanced civilization. At home in southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians not only developed cuneiform writing, but also bureaucracy and artificial irrigation systems. That all these milestones were absolutely groundbreaking should be beyond question. Well, unless you look at the past in a slightly different light. According to Graham Hancock, the social flourishing of the Sumerians was by no means as challenging as it first appears. After all, they were helped considerably in their civilizational rise. A confident assumption that, according to Hancock, applies not only to the Sumerians, but to all ancient civilizations. But how is that even possible? Well, the basic assumption of the British alternative researcher and writer is that long before our time, a highly developed civilization lived on Earth that possessed technologies that we cannot even imagine today. However, this mystical people were wiped out by a global flood disaster at the end of the last ice age. Well, almost, because a few managed to survive the apocalypse and then set out into the world. There, they brought the gift of progress to the simpler peoples, and were worshipped as supernatural deities in return. To substantiate his controversial hypothesis, Hancock refers to the mythologies of ancient peoples, among other things. For although they lived in the most diverse corners of the earth and never met, they essentially knew one and the same story: the story of an all-destroying flood from which higher beings emerged. The striking parallels between the ancient monumental buildings, especially between the pyramids, are also supposed to testify that the roots of the stone colossi lead back to a common origin. Well, that all sounds quite exciting. But if the mysterious precursor culture really was so advanced that it could have traveled the entire world, where is the archaeological evidence for this? Are there any contemporary records that make this assumption more than just mere speculation? Yes, according to Hancock, there are indeed, and mankind has known about them for several centuries. These maps refute the official historiography. When Graham Hancock was once a guest on the famous Joe Rogan Experience, he referred to the maps mentioned at the beginning to back up his convictions with tangible documents. True to the motto, "How can you represent something that you don't know at all?" Hancock posits the historical inconsistencies from the beginning of our video. Quote, "The most striking thing for me is the depiction of Antarctica on old maps, because we only discovered it in 1820, and yet it's on maps that were made in the 16th century and in an astonishing level of detail." According to the official version, the inhabitants of the early modern era could not have known that something like Antarctica even existed. After all, Edward Bransfield did not see the Antarctic Peninsula until around 300 years later. But how can it be explained that the French mathematician and cartographer Laurent Fine immortalized the land masses at the South Pole on his world maps as early as 1534? He added the note, "the newly discovered southern land, which has not yet been fully explored." The bottom line is that we are dealing here with a detailed, colorful depiction on which Eurasia, Africa, and America are highlighted in white. At the same time, the Antarctic continent, which extends over a large part of the lower edge of the map, shines in a rich gold. And even if it's not so easy to see within the heart-shaped frame, Fine got the actual shape of Antarctica pretty much right. An astonishing fact that also catches our eye on a map that the Frenchman drew in 1531. According to Hancock, another document proves that knowledge of the existence of Antarctica was lost over time. The Briton writes, "The Pinkerton world map is particularly remarkable. It dates from 1818 and is based on the most up-to-date knowledge of the time. And where Antarctica is actually located, there is a huge gap, quite simply because it had not yet been discovered." However, the Piri-Reis map and the Waldseemüller world map, which, like Ernst Fein's work, were created in the early 16th century and are also supposed to show us Antarctica, stand in stark contrast to this. Hancock raises the following question: what the hell is Antarctica doing on 16th century maps that we know are based on older sources if nobody knew it even existed back then? Conveniently, he also provides the solution to this profound puzzle in the same breath. We are clearly dealing here with the traces of a lost civilization, a civilization that mapped the entire world and left the evidence behind. Later map makers found these works and used them to make their own maps. These maps can sometimes be very confusing as people try to reconcile the research data of their time with the older information. But when we look at the maps, they are very fascinating. Where are all the lost original maps? At this point, let's just assume that the mysterious precursor civilization actually existed and mapped the entire globe. What do we know then about their mysterious disappearance, and what happened to the documents that the 16th century cartographers drew on? Well, according to Hancock, the answer to the question of the sinking lies dormant in the so-called Junger Dryazite impact theory. This refers to the mysterious, approximately 1,000-year-old cold spell that the Earth experienced at the end of the Weiselian cold period. Hancock believes that this frosty development can be traced back to the explosion of a meteorite in the Earth's atmosphere, when the projectiles shook the ice sheets in North America and Europe at the time. The world's oceans experienced a considerable influx of meltwater, which in turn triggered the devastating flood that wiped the advanced civilization from the Earth. In detail, Hancock states that the sea level rose by no less than 120 meters at that time, and that 27 million square kilometers sank into the ocean. Against this background, it would therefore be reasonable to assume that the traces of the ominous high-tech culture lie dormant somewhere at the bottom of the sea. But Hancock complains that marine archaeology is progressing very slowly, to say the least. In order to find out what stone relics may be lurking underwater and at the same time discover what sources the mapmakers of the early modern era used, we have to move away from Antarctica and take a short detour to warmer climes, namely to the Bahamian island of North Bimini. Off the west coast of the island is a limestone structure about 800 meters long, the so-called Bimini Road. According to mainstream opinion, this is merely a purely natural geological formation. But for Graham Hancock, Bimini Road embodies nothing less than the artificially created relic of a forgotten advanced civilization. And while North Bimini is a tiny island today, it was significantly larger during the Ice Age because the entire Bahamas was still above water back then. A small but significant fact that leads us straight back to the mysterious maps. Hancock comments, "The famous Piri-Reis map of 1513 shows the Bahama Banks as one large island. Bimini Road can also be seen here. But how could Piri-Reis have known that? After all, the structure has been underwater for 6,000 to 7,000 years. Well, he gave us the answer himself. His map is based on 20 older sources, but the originals have since been lost. Piri-Reis suspected that his originals came from the Library of Alexandria and were taken from there to Constantinople. I believe that someone explored and mapped the world during the Ice Age and left the evidence for posterity." But then, why are the maps so flawed? It is in the nature of things that Hancock's explanations do not only earn applause in the ranks of the long-established research community. Quite the opposite. The majority of conventional experts firmly reject the British scientists' theories. With regard to the Antarctic maps, those who do not have much to do with a world-traveling precursor culture emphasize that the supposed evidence has some glaring inaccuracies. For example, we search in vain for Palmerland, which belongs to the Antarctic Peninsula. In principle, it is conceivable that the old maps of Antarctica were territorial maps on which some regions were left out. We know something similar from some maps of the United States on which Canada and Mexico were also omitted. However, the depicted rivers on the northwestern coast of West Antarctica speak against this assumption. According to the alternative camp, this rather indicates that the area was bounded by a body of water, because a land boundary between Palmer Land and West Antarctica would show a fixed boundary. However, Hancock is not at all perturbed by such inconsistencies. The maps are so flawed because they are quite simply children of their time. As the cartographers of the 16th century tried to combine their knowledge with the significantly older models, the results were sometimes very confusing. The question of when our next video will be online need no longer puzzle you. Please feel free to press the like and subscribe buttons now and stay up to date from now on.